I've just come across an algorithm post on my Facebook newsfeed, and the poster was anonymous, but it came from a page called Feminist News. Um, and basically, it said, "Correct me if I'm wrong, but a 30-year-old man has no business dating an 18 or 23-year-old woman." That's not exactly verbatim, but that was more or less the gist of it. Interestingly enough, a lot of the responses were negative, saying things that yes, you are wrong. So I suppose that's good if it indicates some feminists are on the side of common sense. Um, and you know, if there are women pushing back against that way of thinking. Um, a disclaimer before I get into this one: the whole thing about free will, people making the determination for their own decisions in life. I think broadly it's a very good thing. It's an important thing, self-sovereignty, but there are areas that need to be considered. Certainly legal areas, that's an obvious one. But in the case of, I'm just thinking, I've just said legal areas need to be considered, varies greatly from country to country. So again, the context there. But what I was going to say is that there is some, it's not always black and white regarding free will. I would cite the example, I've been very vocal about the Jeremy Kyle show, and some other reality TV examples, because its supporters will always say, oh, the guests made the decision to go on themselves. But where does the free will argument come into that when people are misled? And there's evidence that people are misled. Or if we want to use the sex trade as an example, it's true that sex workers generally will, they will often resist any attempts to make it illegal, but it's also true that they may be in situations in life, for example, poverty, that's forcing them to do that. Certainly in the Victorian period, that's why a lot of women took to the streets, not because of lust, as moralists put it, but because literally they were impoverished and they had no other choice. So the free will thing isn't necessarily black and white. Context is very important. Having said that, when it comes to dating, I think that broadly speaking, so long as both parties are adults, so long as there's no evidence of coercion, then really it's no one else's business. Sometimes if it's an interracial thing, there will be cultural challenges to overcome. There may be language barriers to overcome. And like I say, there's obviously legal things. If one person is underage, that's obviously a legal matter. But if we're talking about people over the age of 18, then really it isn't anyone else's business. I suppose you could argue if they're cheating on someone else, if they're being unfaithful, if they're married, most people would say that's wrong. People shouldn't mess around. But even there, it's not really anyone else's business except the wrong party. The husband or the wife who has been cheated on, or perhaps children, they're really the only people who should pass judgment, or who have a right to be hurt or angry about that. In terms of the example that presumably she gave, of, a 30-year-old man and an 18 or 23-year-old woman, 18, I personally do think that is a bit young, because technically she's an adult, but she is still in her teen years, and, I would say that's a bit questionable. 23, no, I really don't think that's such a big issue. I mean, I was 29, I had a 23-year-old girlfriend, and that's not something that age really wasn't a factor for us. It didn't work out for other reasons, but age was never the issue. It's a bit like, this reminds me of those people who have hostility to interracial dating. They always cite, they'll always highlight cases that don't work out, whilst ignoring the fact that you could have, for example, two white people a white couple who break up, or a black couple who break up. Well, it's the same principle in a way with the age thing, because if you get an example of a much older man and a much younger woman and it doesn't work out, then there will be people who jump on that and say, oh, look, that's evidence it doesn't work out. But there's plenty of examples of people who are in a relationship with someone their own age or a similar age and it also doesn't work out. I mean, I would put this out there. What if you have a young woman who dates a guy her own age or a similar age, and he turns out to be a real nasty piece of work? He might be aggressive, abusive, controlling, and then that's the experience she has, and then she has to rebuild her life, and she comes across an older man, let's say he's 10 years older, even 12, 15 years older. He turns out to be a very compassionate, understanding, mature individual, and she finds that she really has genuine happiness with him. What on earth gives a feminist the right to say to her, no, you cannot be happy because I think that's inappropriate? I just think that's very obnoxious. It's very controlling, and it flies in the face of what feminists claim it's all about, is respecting women's rights and self-sovereignty to make their own decisions. And I think it is one of the biggest image problems that feminism has when some feminists think they can lecture other women the way they do. Um, I think that's totally. I think it comes across as obnoxious, unless there is a clear cut case of like Stockholm syndrome, where sometimes you get situations where a woman is being the victim of domestic violence and she'll defend the husband or the boyfriend, and it's kind of this. I'm not a psychologist, but I think it comes under Stockholm syndrome, where perhaps he's financially controlling her, so she feels she has to defend him because if she goes against him, she'll be cut off or something. Um, I've heard cases of men coming to defend women, and then the woman actually from another man, and the woman, instead of kind of showing gratitude, will turn on him. So sometimes you do get that situation, but in this case, we're talking about age. 7 years. I mean, a 23-year-old and a 30-year-old. Would they be making the same issue if the example was, say, a 60-year-old man and a 53-year-old woman? No one would care. Or even, say, a 40-year-old man and a 33-year-old woman. Why focus on a 30-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman? 30 is still relatively young. It's not like he's an old man and she's a girl. The gap really isn't that big. Indeed, it's likely that they're in the same generation. They're likely to be both millennials. So I just think it's pretty obnoxious to say, no, that's inappropriate. You can't do that. How about minding your own damn business? If feminism is really about women's rights and it's really about self-determination, then respect that. Stick to actual human rights abuses. Stick to things like FGM, forced marriages, sexual violence, that sort of thing, domestic violence. Those are serious human rights issues. But a young woman deciding that she wants a slightly older partner, that's no one's business but theirs. There has been a bit of focus in the celebrity world on this because Hollywood actors like Leonardo DiCaprio and Nicolas Cage have kind of got attention for having much younger partners. Now, I happen to think celebrities tend to be quite eccentric anyway. Again, though, the principle really applies. Whose business is it but theirs? So what if Leonardo DiCaprio doesn't want to get married? You know, why should he get married? That's not an obligation on anyone, or it shouldn't be. And if his younger partners are happy, if they're not being coerced, I mean, some cynics might say actually they're just after his money because he's a wealthy A-lister. Who knows? I mean, I would really say unless there is strong evidence of coercion there, and yeah, sometimes gap. I personally think, for instance, if the age is a significant gap, I would personally think that's probably not a good idea. Say the guy is 44, or actually DiCaprio is 50 now, and his partner, I think they've been cited, is in their early 20s. I do think that's quite a gap. But if things don't work out, that's their business. Like I say, two 23-year-olds could have a very rocky relationship. So there's an ageism to this, actually. There's an ageism in saying, oh, well, he must be the wrong choice just because he's older. And you can be absolutely sure if a man was to lecture a feminist on who she should and shouldn't date, she'd be screaming about the overbearing patriarchy. So spare me the hypocrisy. You know, if you're really about women's rights, then respect the right of women to choose. Unless there is clear-cut example of coercion or abuse or anything shady in that sense. But simply being an age gap, I don't think that's enough of a reason to dictate to others. Let me know your thoughts.